The emergency room smelled like bleach and copper that night. Nurse Mara Voss had been on her feet for 19 hours when the first slap landed, open-palmed, hard enough to knock her sideways into a steel cart. The crash echoed through the ward. Nobody moved. Security guards found something interesting to study on the floor tiles. Senior staff suddenly needed to be somewhere else. The man who hit her laughed. He was 26 years old, wore a watch worth more than most nurses earned in a year, and his last name was carved into the hospital's east wing in 4-foot bronze letters. He thought that made him untouchable. He had no idea who he'd just put his hands on. If you want to see how one nurse brought down an entire empire, stay with me until the very last word. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The shift had started quietly enough, which should have been the first warning. In emergency medicine, quiet was never a good sign. Quiet meant the chaos hadn't arrived yet. It was simply gathering itself somewhere out of sight, building pressure behind a door that would eventually blow off its hinges. Mara Voss had learned that lesson in places most civilian nurses would never see, and she'd carried it with her into every hospital shift since. Trust the noise, respect the chaos, fear the silence. Hargrove Memorial Medical Center sat in the middle of Raleigh, North Carolina, a 12-story tower of glass and steel that had been privately acquired 7 years ago by the Decker Group, a holding company run by a man named Gerald Decker, who appeared on local business covers twice a year and donated to every mayoral campaign regardless of party. The hospital was profitable. That was what people said when they talked about it. Not good, not excellent, profitable. Mara had taken the position 14 months ago after leaving a federal contract that she was not permitted to discuss in detail. Her personnel file at Hargrove listed her previous employer as the Department of Veterans Affairs. That was technically accurate and completely misleading, and she'd let it stay that way without apology. She needed the work. She was good at it. That should have been enough. At 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October, the ER was running at about 70% capacity. 3 trauma bays occupied, one awaiting a transfer from a car accident 2 miles north on the interstate. Mara was managing the intake board, tracking a 16-year-old girl named Jalen Torres, who had come in 40 minutes ago with blunt chest trauma and a blood pressure reading that made Mara's stomach tighten every time she checked it. Jalen had been a passenger in the back seat. The driver, her older brother, hadn't made it to the hospital. A uniformed officer had told the paramedics that much and nothing more, and Mara had caught the look on the man's face. That particular careful blankness that cops learned when they had to carry information they couldn't say out loud yet. Jalen didn't know. She was asking about her brother every time she had enough breath to form the question, and the nurses were answering with variations of, "We're focused on you right now," which was true, and also a way of keeping the worst thing at bay for a few more minutes. Dr. Yolanda Marsh was the attending on Jalen's bay. She was 53, had been at Hargrove for 11 years, and was the kind of physician who spoke in complete sentences and made eye contact when she gave bad news, which Mara had learned to recognize as rarer than it should be. Yolanda had ordered a CT scan 40 minutes ago. The scan was backed up because one of the 2 machines was offline. Had been offline for 3 weeks, pending a parts order that kept getting delayed by the procurement department. So Jalen was waiting, and her pressure kept doing things it shouldn't, and Mara kept watching the clock on the wall above Bay 3. She was rechecking the IV line when the noise started near the front entrance. Not the usual ER noise, not the drunk guy arguing with the triage nurse, not the toddler screaming in the waiting area, not the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the shuffle of gurney wheels on linoleum. This was a different register. Louder than it needed to be, with that particular quality of entitlement that Mara had learned to identify before she could see its source, the kind of volume that assumed everyone else in the room should stop what they were doing and pay attention. She didn't stop what she was doing. Someone needs to come deal with this right now. The voice was male, early to mid-20s, the accent of someone who had grown up being told his time was worth more than other people's. "Do you understand who I am? I've been waiting 11 minutes. Mara finished checking the IV, made a note on Jalen's chart, and looked up. The man at the front desk was tall, dark-haired, wearing a shirt that probably cost $400 and had been partially unbuttoned in the way that was supposed to look casual and instead looked calculated. He had his hand flat on the reception desk, leaning forward into the space of the intake coordinator, a woman named Patrice who had been working nights at Hargrove for 9 years and had the patience of someone who had weathered everything and the posture of someone who was currently weathering something. Beside him stood a woman around his age, her left hand wrapped in a cloth that had been white before it got whatever was on it now. Small cut, Mara assessed automatically. Superficial, almost certainly. She'd seen the same type of wound get categorized as critical in triage notes when the name attached to the file carried enough weight. Mr. Decker, I don't want an explanation, Patrice. He said her name like he'd looked at her badge specifically so he could use it that way. I want someone to see Alexis right now. That cut is deep, and it's been open for 20 minutes, and nobody in this waiting room has done anything. Mara pulled her attention back to the board. She had 3 things that needed to happen in the next 4 minutes before she could address anything else. Patrice's voice was careful, practiced. We're triaging by severity of... Severity. The word came back harder. Do you know what my father built here? Do you know what his name is on that wing out there? Severity is whatever I say it is tonight. The young man's name was Ryan Decker. Mara knew this the same way she knew most things at Hargrove that weren't written anywhere official, through accumulation, through the things people said quietly in break rooms and the things they didn't say at all. Ryan was Gerald Decker's only son, 25 years old, held a nominal position in the Decker group that nobody could define clearly when asked. He came to the hospital maybe once a month. The staff had learned over time what his visits meant and how to navigate them. Navigation meant accommodation. It always did. She completed the third of her 4-minute tasks and looked up again. Ryan was now on the other side of the desk. He had walked around it, past the low barrier that was supposed to designate staff-only space, and he was standing close enough to Patrice that the woman had taken an involuntary half-step back. He wasn't touching her. He was doing something more deliberate than touching. He was occupying her space and watching her respond to it and smiling in a way that wasn't a smile. I'm going to find someone who understands how this works, he said, and when I do, we're going to have a very different conversation about what happened tonight. He turned away from Patrice and walked toward the treatment area. Mara was already moving toward Jalen's bay when she heard Patrice say quietly, the way people said things they knew nobody would officially acknowledge, "He can't just come back here." And then silence, because nobody official said anything back. The next 18 minutes were the kind that happen in emergency departments all over the country every night. Compressed, fragmented, running on instinct and training, and the specific muscle memory that came from doing something under pressure until it became reflexive. Jalen's pressure had dropped another 4 points. Yolanda wanted a second IV line and a repeat ultrasound. Mara was starting the line when she heard Ryan Decker's voice again, closer now, coming from the direction of the central nursing station. She tied off the line, verified flow, spoke quietly to Jalen. "You're doing okay, your numbers are stabilizing," which was partially true and partially the kind of calibrated reassurance that kept frightened patients from going further into shock. Then she stepped out of the bay. Ryan was at the nursing station with a charge nurse named Deb Holloway, who had 20 years on Mara and was currently demonstrating those 20 years through the particular quality of her stillness. Deb was not moving, not flinching, not escalating. She was doing what experienced nurses learn to do in situations that hadn't yet crossed a line, but were walking toward it. She was waiting. "I need a nurse with Alexis now," Ryan was saying. "Not in 20 minutes. Now. She's been sitting in that waiting room and nobody has... Mr. Decker, your companion has been registered and triaged. She's category 3, which means what? Which means because my father doesn't write enough checks, she sits there bleeding while the cut is approximately 2 centimeters and is not actively bleeding." Deb's voice was the same temperature it had been since the beginning of the sentence. "We have a patient in Bay 3 with internal injuries, 2 more with acute presentations, and a transfer incoming. When a bay opens, open one now." "I can't do that." The pause that followed was about 2 seconds long. Mara had learned, in context she still didn't discuss, to read the quality of pauses. This one was the kind that came before a decision. Ryan's hand moved first. He reached out and grabbed Deb's wrist. Not hard, but deliberate, with fingers that wrapped, and held, and said, with a tone that had dropped to something quieter, and therefore worse, "Then let me explain to you how this is going to go." Deb didn't make a sound. Mara crossed the distance between them in 6 steps. Let go of her arm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The tone was the thing. She'd used it in field hospitals when the noise level was such that nuance was impossible and you needed someone's full attention immediately. It worked differently in a quiet ER at midnight, but it worked. Ryan turned and looked at her. His expression went through several rapid adjustments: surprise, assessment, dismissal, and landed on something like amusement. "Who are you?" "Mara Voss. I'm one of the nurses on this floor." She held eye contact. "Let go of her arm, please." He released Deb's wrist slowly, like he was doing them all a favor. "Okay, Mara." The way he said her name had the same quality as when he'd said Patrice. Weaponizing the familiar. "What are you going to do about this? Is there a doctor I can talk to? Someone with actual authority? Because the staff here seems to have some confusion about—" "There's no confusion," Mara said. "The patient in Bay 3 is a 16-year-old with chest trauma and a dropping blood pressure. She takes priority over a non-bleeding laceration. That's not opinion. That's triage protocol." "My father—" "I know who your father is." She said it without emphasis, which was worse than anger. "It doesn't change what I just told you. When a bay opens, someone will come get your companion, and she'll be seen. Until then, the waiting room is through there." The security guard at the door, a heavy-set man named Ty, who Mara had spoken to maybe 4 times in 14 months, was watching the exchange with the focused attention of someone who had decided not to intervene unless absolutely necessary and was currently recalibrating his threshold for absolutely necessary. Ryan took 1 step toward her. "You know what I think happens to nurses who talk to me like that?" "I don't know," she said. "I know what happens to patients who don't get treated. I'd rather focus on that." Something moved behind his eyes. She'd seen it before, in different people and different circumstances. The moment when someone ran a fast calculation about what they could do and who would stop them and what the cost would be, and arrived at an answer they didn't like and decided to take their frustration out on the nearest available target. He shoved her. Not a stumble, not an accidental collision. His hand caught her shoulder and drove her back, hard enough that she hit the metal edge of the supply cart behind her, and the whole thing shifted on its wheels. The crash was louder than the strike itself. Instruments scattered across the floor. A tray of sealed packages hit the linoleum and slid 6 feet. The room froze. Not in solidarity, not in outrage. In the particular freeze of institutional paralysis, people calculating whether this was their problem yet, whether someone else would handle it, whether stepping in would cost them something they weren't willing to spend. Mara straightened up. Her shoulder was going to bruise. She could already feel the specific ache of metal contact against bone. She looked at Ryan, who was breathing hard and smiling in a way that wasn't a smile, and she stayed exactly where she was. "Don't do that again," she said. "Or what?" He took another step. His hand came up again. "You gonna call security? Ty over there?" He didn't look at the guard. He didn't need to. "You gonna file a report? Who processes those reports? You know whose name is on the building that processes those reports?" Deb was against the wall. Patrice had appeared in the doorway from the waiting area and immediately understood what she was looking at and went very still. 2 other nurses stood at the far edge of the nursing station, close enough to witness, distant enough to deny it. Ryan's hand was still raised. "Touch her again, and this ends badly for you." The voice came from the entrance to the treatment area, the bay corridor that technically required an access badge to enter. The man standing there was in civilian clothes, plain dark shirt, worn jacket. He was with a German shepherd that sat at his left side with the kind of stillness that was not natural in dogs but was trained into certain dogs for specific purposes. The man wasn't large in the way that projected threat. He was average height, lean, the type that didn't announce itself until it was already in the room. But the room had already changed. Ryan turned. "Who the hell are you?" "My name isn't relevant right now." The man took 2 steps forward, unhurried. "What's relevant is that you just assaulted a nurse in front of witnesses, and your hand is still up." He stopped. He didn't close the rest of the distance. He didn't need to. "Put it down." His name was Daniel Reyes, and he had come to Hargrove Memorial at 11:20 p.m. for a reason that had nothing to do with Ryan Decker. He was 34 years old. He held a rank he couldn't discuss in a unit that didn't officially exist, and he'd spent the last decade in circumstances that had given him a particular relationship with chaos, not fear of it, not comfort with it exactly, but a kind of fluency. He could read the temperature of a room the way other people read weather, and what he'd read when he walked into the ER 23 minutes ago had made him slow down before he even understood why. The dog's name was Cole. Malinois Shepherd Cross, 4 years old, trained to Reyes's specific patterns in ways that made them function as a unit rather than a handler and animal. Cole had been the one to register the shift in the room first, a subtle realignment of attention, the way his ears had tracked toward the nursing station 4 minutes before Reyes understood what was happening there. He had come to Hargrove because of a man in room 412, a patient named Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, retired, who had called him 2 days ago from a number Reyes had only given to 6 people in the world. Webb had sounded wrong in a way that had nothing to do with his injury. Not scared, not confused, wrong in the specific way that people who had spent time in the field sounded when they'd found something and didn't yet know what to do with it. That conversation was still sitting in the back of Reyes's mind when he'd walked into the ER and seen a man in a $400 shirt with his hand raised toward a woman who hadn't stepped back. He'd read her correctly, he thought. The way she was standing, not retreating, not escalating, distributing her weight without appearing to. The specific quality of stillness that came from training in environments where stillness was a survival skill. He didn't know her name yet. He knew the posture. Ryan lowered his hand. The movement was slow. Performance of calm he didn't feel. He looked at Reyes with the calculation of someone trying to assess a threat and arriving at uncertain conclusions. "You got a badge? Some kind of authority here?" "I have a dog who's been calm for 11 minutes, Reyes said, "and I'd like to keep it that way. You want to tell me your name, or should I find out some other way?" The balance in the room had shifted. Ty, the security guard, had moved 3 steps closer without being obvious about it, following the emotional lead of someone who had just demonstrated authority more effectively than he had. Deb Holloway had her hand on the phone at the nursing station. 2 of the other nurses had stopped pretending to be elsewhere. Ryan looked around the room, read his numbers. His jaw tightened. "This isn't over," he said to Mara directly. Then he walked toward the waiting area, shoulders set in the specific geometry of humiliation converting itself to future threat. Cole watched him leave. Mara turned to Deb. "You okay?" "Yeah." Deb's voice was controlled in the deliberate way. "You?" "I'm fine." She wasn't thinking about her shoulder. She was thinking about Jalen in Bay 3 and the CT that still hadn't happened. She looked at Reyes. "You shouldn't be back here without clearance." "I know." He held her gaze without apology. "Room 412. I'm visiting a patient named Marcus Webb. I came in through the wrong door." Something in his tone made her pause. Not the content, the precision, the way he said it, the way he was watching her face as he said it. She'd interviewed enough people in enough circumstances to understand when someone was telling you the truth and simultaneously telling you there was something else. "Visiting hours ended at 9, she said. "Webb called me at 2 a.m. the night before last. He sounded like someone who needed a visitor." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced an ID card that looked official but that she couldn't immediately categorize. "I can go through the front desk if you need me to." She held it another moment, then said, "The elevator's at the end of this corridor, 4th floor." She turned back to the nursing station. "Deb, I need an update on Jalen's scan." She was already moving when her phone buzzed against her hip. Unknown number. She didn't recognize the area code. She almost let it go. 19 hours in, she had 100 things ahead of the notification. But something made her stop in the doorway of Bay 3 and look at the screen. The message was 3 lines. "You had your moment. Enjoy it. Your employment status is under review effective tomorrow morning. You picked the wrong night to be someone's hero." She looked at the screen for 3 seconds. Then she set the phone face down on the supply shelf at the bay entrance, pulled on a fresh glove, and went back to check Jalen Torres's blood pressure. The scan came back 17 minutes later. Yolanda Marsh reviewed it at the mobile terminal, and Mara watched her face, because Yolanda's face was where the truth lived before the clinical language organized it. The doctor was still for a second, not the practiced stillness of someone managing her reaction, but the genuine, unguarded half-second when information landed before professional training caught up. "She has a splenic lac," Yolanda said quietly. "Grade 3. She needs surgery. How fast?" "Now." Yolanda was already reaching for the phone. "Get me OR3. Mara was at the bed in 4 steps. Jalen was awake, glassy, too pale, but awake, which mattered. "Jalen." She kept her voice level. "We know what's going on now. We're going to fix it. I need you to stay with me, okay? Just keep looking at me." "My brother," Jalen started. "Right now, the only thing I need you thinking about is you." Mara took the girl's hand, which was cold. "You can ask me about Marcus in a minute. Right now, stay here." She had used her brother's name without intending to. She caught it immediately, but Jalen's eyes sharpened. Even through the fog of pain and blood loss, the name registered, landed in the place where she'd been carrying it. "How do you know his name?" Mara held her gaze and said, "I know everything we need to know to take care of you tonight. That's my job." It was not an answer, and it was not a lie. "OR team is coming. You're going to be okay." It took another 4 minutes to get Jalen prepped and transferred, and in those 4 minutes, Mara ran on the particular fuel that had no name, not adrenaline, not professionalism exactly, but the thing underneath both of those, the thing that had kept her functional in places where the stakes were higher than this and the resources were worse. She knew how to work without margin. She knew how to keep her face still when her hands needed to be steady. When the gurney went through the OR doors and the corridor was quiet again, she stood in the hallway for exactly 15 seconds and let herself feel the weight of the shift. Her shoulder ached where she'd hit the cart. The message on her phone was still sitting there. Somewhere on the 4th floor, a man named Daniel Reyes was visiting a patient who had called him at 2 in the morning, and whatever that conversation was about had not been resolved. She picked up her phone, looked at the message again. "Your employment status is under review. 14 months of nights. 2 overtime weekends per month." The moment she'd declined a job offer in Charlotte because she'd promised herself she would stay somewhere long enough to actually matter, and Hargrove had been the place she'd decided to stay. She had good numbers. Her patient outcomes were in the top percentile for the floor. She had never, in 14 months, been formally written up for anything. And in the next 8 hours, someone with a Decker Group email address was going to try to dismantle all of it because their son had wanted a bay first. She put the phone back in her pocket, walked to the nursing station, sat down, and started charting the Jalen Torres case with the specificity of someone building a record that would survive scrutiny. Timestamps, clinical decisions, the exact sequence of triage determinations. She wrote it the way she'd been taught to document things in environments where documentation was the difference between accountability and oblivion. Deb appeared beside her, set a coffee cup on the desk without a word, and went back to her own charting. That was the whole conversation. That was enough. At 2:15 a.m., Mara took her first break of the shift, 12 minutes, no longer, because 3 new intakes had arrived and she'd be back at the board in 13. She walked to the vending machine alcove near the elevator bank, fed in $2 for something that would be too sweet and not enough, and sat against the wall for a moment with her eyes closed. She heard the elevator open. Reyes stepped out. Cole was at his left side, and the dog's attention swept the corridor in the way that had nothing to do with seeing threats and everything to do with mapping space. Mara recognized it. "How is he?" she said, without opening her eyes. A pause. Awake. Talking. Another pause. "More than I expected." "Is he sick?" "He has a pulmonary infection. He's been here 5 days." Reyes leaned against the opposite wall. In her peripheral vision, she could see him looking at the ceiling, not at her. "That's not why I came." She opened her eyes. "I know." He looked at her then. "You know who I am?" he said. "I know you're not a casual visitor at 2 a.m. She pulled the cap off her drink. "I know the dog is a working dog, and you're not keeping him as a pet. I know you didn't come in through the wrong door by accident." She looked at him steadily. I know you watched the situation with Decker for a few minutes before you stepped in, which means you were running an assessment, not just reacting. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly. Recognition. Mara Voss, he said. 14 months at Hargrove. Before that, DVA. Before that is not public record. No, he agreed. It isn't. He was quiet for a moment. Cole shifted his weight and leaned slightly against Reyes's leg, which Mara read as the dog registering its handler's increase in focus without being able to identify a threat to address. Webb told me about some things he noticed during his stay. What kind of things? Billing irregularities, supply issues. He asked a nurse about a medication he'd been prescribed, and she told him it had been back-ordered for 3 weeks. He looked it up. It wasn't back-ordered. Reyes was watching her face. And he heard some things through the wall of his room. His neighbor was moved in the middle of the night. No family notification. Webb asked about him the next morning. Mara was very still. What did they tell him? That the patient had been discharged. He met her eyes. Webb has been in hospitals. He knows what discharge sounds like at 2 a.m. and what other things sound like. The vending machine hummed behind her. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor was beeping in the low, patient, meaningless way that indicated a reading within acceptable range. Everything was exactly as calm as it had been 10 seconds ago. How long has he been documenting this? She said. 8 months. Reyes said it quietly. He started writing things down after the third time something felt wrong. Names, dates, room numbers. He's got it in a notebook in his room. A pause. He told me he was going to give it to hospital administration. I talked him out of that. She understood why immediately. Administration here reports to the Decker Group, she said. Yeah. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't look at it immediately. She was thinking about Jalen Torres in OR3 and the CT machine that had been offline for 3 weeks, and the medication that wasn't back-ordered but had been reported as back-ordered, and the patient who had been moved in the middle of the night, and the message on her phone that said, "Your employment status is under review." She looked at the screen. Different number this time, but she recognized the name on the message. Sandra Okafor, one of the night supervisors, a woman who had been at Hargrove for longer than anyone, and had the particular care of someone navigating something she couldn't name directly. Ryan Decker spoke to his father 10 minutes ago. Gerald Decker called Dr. Westbrook at home. There's a meeting scheduled tomorrow at 8 a.m. HR is being pulled in. I don't know what they have, but I know it's not good. Watch yourself tonight. Mara read it twice. Then she looked up at Reyes. That notebook, she said. Tell me it's not the only copy. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she watched him run the same kind of assessment she'd run on him. The rapid, layered reading of a person under pressure, the measurement of what they were, and whether it matched what they were presenting. Whatever he saw, he answered honestly. It's the only copy. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere above them, on the 4th floor, a retired sergeant named Marcus Webb was lying in a hospital bed with 8 months of documented evidence in a notebook beside him in a building owned by the man who was currently on the phone destroying her career. And in 7 hours, there would be a meeting. I need to go back to my floor, she said, standing up. She looked at Reyes directly. You need to go back upstairs. She held the look long enough that the instruction inside those 2 words was clear. Don't let anyone else into that room tonight. She dropped the drink in the trash, straightened her badge, and walked back toward the ER. Behind her, Cole made a low sound. Not a bark, not a growl. Something between the two. An acknowledgement. She didn't turn around. The last 3 hours of the shift passed the way the worst hours always did. Not in a rush, but in accumulation. A chest pain case that resolved. A child with a fever that didn't. A man who had been waiting 4 hours with kidney stones, and who thanked Mara with the specific, exhausted sincerity of someone who had stopped expecting to be seen and was startled to find himself seen anyway. At 6:50 a.m., 10 minutes before handoff, Mara completed her charts. She cross-referenced every entry twice. She flagged Jalen Torres' case for surgical follow-up and noted in clinical language that was as clear as she could make it the sequence of events that had delayed the CT scan, including the time the second machine had gone offline and the dates on the procurement request that had never been filled. At 7:02 a.m., Sandra Okafor found her at the locker room entrance. Sandra was 51, broad-shouldered, the kind of person who delivered bad news without softening it into uselessness. She looked at Mara the way people looked when they were trying to figure out how much the other person already knew. "Gerald Decker is in the building," she said. "He arrived 20 minutes ago. He's in a conference room on the 3rd floor with HR and legal." "I know," Mara said. Sandra's expression shifted slightly. "How do you know?" "Because Ryan Decker is his father's son," she said. "And people like that don't wait for morning. They just call it morning when they're ready." She opened her locker. "Who else is in the meeting?" "Dr. Westbrook, possibly one of the board liaisons." Sandra paused. "Mara, they have a record. I don't know what's in it, but they built something overnight. Witnesses willing to say that you were verbally aggressive with a visitor, that you created a hostile situation, that you refused to provide care." "Jalen Torres is out of surgery," Mara said. She pulled her bag from the locker, closed it. She went in at 12:47 a.m. with a grade 3 splenic laceration. "She's in recovery. The surgical team has the chart." She looked at Sandra. "That's what I did with my shift last night." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "They're going to try to suspend you pending review." "I know. And then they're going to let the review take 6 months, and in 6 months, nobody will remember what started it, and the result will be whatever Gerald Decker wants the result to be." Sandra's voice was flat, not cruel, just true. "That's how this works here. That's how it's always worked." Mara slung her bag over her shoulder. "What time is the meeting?" she said. 8. She looked at her watch. 7:09 a.m. "Okay," she said. And she walked out of the locker room toward the elevator, and she pressed the button for the 4th floor, and she stood with her hands still at her sides as the doors closed. In a conference room 2 floors above her, Gerald Decker and a team of lawyers were building the version of last night that they needed to be true. In OR recovery, a 16-year-old girl was waking up alive because of a decision made at triage. In room 412, a notebook sat beside a hospital bed. The elevator doors opened. Reyes was in the hallway. He looked at her, and she could see from the way he was standing that he hadn't slept, and that it hadn't mattered, and that something in the last hour had changed. "Webb showed me everything," he said. "All 8 months." His voice was quiet, precise. "Mara, it's not just billing, it's not just supplies." He held her gaze, and she watched him decide to say the rest of it. 3 patients, last 6 months. Complications that shouldn't have killed them. Medications that were documented as administered that weren't. And a night nurse who transferred out 4 months ago, who Webb says was asked to stay quiet about what she saw. The corridor was empty except for them. She looked at the door to room 412. "Is the notebook still there?" "No," he said, and from inside his jacket he produced a folded envelope. "It's here. And I photographed every page at 4 a.m. and sent the files to 2 people I trust who are not in this building. The weight of the shift, the 19 hours, the shoulder, the message, the meeting waiting downstairs. All of it was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere. But underneath it, something else had settled into place. The specific, familiar clarity of understanding exactly what a situation required." She looked at the envelope, then at Reyes. "Gerald Decker is in a conference room on the 3rd floor," she said. "He thinks the meeting at 8 is about me." Reyes said nothing. "What happens," she said carefully, "if someone walks into that meeting with documentation of something larger than a personnel complaint?" He was quiet for a moment. Cole sat between them, perfectly still. "That depends," Reyes said, "on who walks in and what they're willing to say." She held out her hand. He gave her the envelope. She took the stairs. Not because the elevator was slow, it wasn't, but because she needed the 40 seconds of vertical movement to run through what she was walking into and make sure she wasn't making a mistake she couldn't undo. The envelope was in her bag now, inside a zippered pocket. Her badge was clipped to her chest. Her scrubs still had a faint rust-colored stain near the left cuff from Jalen Torres's IV setup 12 hours ago. And she had not changed, and she was not going to change because the stain was honest in a way that a clean set of clothes would not be. 3rd floor. Conference Room B. She knew the building's layout the way she knew most things. Through repetition, through the habit of mapping exits, through 14 months of walking the same corridors at hours when most people were asleep. She paused outside the conference room door and listened. Voices. At least 4. Gerald Decker's she recognized from the 2 times she'd seen him in the building, a controlled baritone that had the particular practice quality of a man who had spent decades saying whatever he wanted and having it treated as reasonable. A woman's voice, clipped and precise. Legal. A man she didn't recognize. And then Dr. Westbrook, the hospital's chief medical officer, whose voice had the quality of a man trying very hard not to sound like he was doing what he was doing. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting. The room had a long table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard with nothing on it. 4 people turned to look at her. Gerald Decker was at the head of the table, 62 years old, silver-haired, the build of someone who had once been athletic and had let it shift into something that still projected authority. The woman to his right had a legal pad and the expression of someone who had been through versions of this meeting before. The unknown man was young, 30s, too clean suit, with a laptop open in front of him. Westbrook was at the far end, and he looked at Mara for exactly half a second before he looked away. That half second told her everything about where he stood. Ms. Voss. Gerald Decker said her name without inflection. This meeting hasn't started yet. I know. She closed the door behind her. I wanted to get here before it did. The lawyer, whose name Mara would learn later was Tricia Holt, set down her pen with the careful precision of someone recalibrating. This is an HR review session. You should have representation present before. I don't have union representation at this hospital because Hargrove Memorial has a documented history of discouraging union enrollment. Mara pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table from Gerald Decker and sat down. I'm aware of that because it's in the same documentation I've been reading this morning. Silence. Gerald Decker looked at her the way powerful men looked at things that had stopped behaving predictably. Not with anger yet, but with the attention of someone updating their model. You had a difficult night, he said. My son was involved in an incident that your son assaulted 2 members of nursing staff, Mara said, in front of witnesses. On camera, if the footage still exists, which I'll admit I'm not certain about given how administrative decisions move in this building. She kept her voice the same temperature it had been since she sat down. I'm not here to argue about last night. I'm here because I think you're going to try to suspend me in the next 20 minutes, and I want to tell you what happens after that. Holt leaned forward. Ms. Voss, I'd advise you strongly not to make statements that Hargrove Memorial Medical Center has filed Medicare billing claims for procedures and services on at least 11 patients in the past 18 months that were either not performed or performed using substituted materials not reflected in the billing codes. She set her bag on the table but didn't open it yet. 3 of those patients died following complications that their families were told were unavoidable. The medical documentation in 2 of those cases contains entries time-stamped at hours when the attending physician was not in the building, which is verifiable through badge access records. She looked at Gerald Decker. The 3rd case is more complicated, and I think you know that. The room had a specific quality of silence now. Not the silence of surprise. Decker's face had not changed in the way surprised faces changed. It had gone still, which was different. Stillness in a powerful man was not innocence. Stillness was calculation. Westbrook had his hands flat on the table. The young man with the laptop had stopped typing. Those are very serious allegations, Holt said carefully. Yes, they are. Mara folded her hands. They're also documented. Dates, room numbers, patient identifiers, the names of staff who were present and were subsequently transferred or resigned. 8 months of documentation assembled by a patient currently on the 4th floor of this building who spent a significant portion of his career in situations where paying attention to details was the difference between people surviving and not. She paused. He's good at it. Gerald Decker set down his coffee cup. It made a quiet sound against the table. Whatever you think you have, he said, and his voice had not risen, had not changed register at all, which was its own kind of warning. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing with it. This hospital employs 412 people. It serves this community. The things you're describing, if they were true, which they're not, but if they were, releasing that kind of information without going through proper channels would— I'm not releasing it, Mara said. I'm telling you it exists. That's different. He studied her. What do you want? He said. It was the first honest question he'd asked since she walked in, and she recognized it as such. The performance had lasted about 4 minutes. Underneath it, Gerald Decker was a man who understood transactions, and he had just arrived at the part of the conversation he was comfortable with. I want you to be very clear about something before this meeting goes any further, she said. Whatever you built overnight, whatever your son told you, whatever version of last night lives in the documents on that laptop, it goes away, quietly, and the employment review goes away with it. And in exchange, nothing. I'm not negotiating. I'm telling you what the situation is. Holt put her hand on Decker's arm. A small gesture, careful, the kind lawyers made when they wanted to say stop talking without saying it out loud. Decker didn't look at her. You're a night nurse on a 12-hour rotation, he said. You've been at this hospital for 14 months. You have no legal standing, no formal protection, and whatever you think you documented, I have attorneys who— The files were sent to 2 recipients this morning at approximately 4 a.m. She watched his face. Neither of them is in this building. One of them is a federal investigator. The other is someone whose institutional affiliation I'm not going to describe in this room. She opened her bag and set the envelope on the table without opening it. This is a physical copy, but you already understand that physical copies aren't the thing you need to worry about. Decker's eyes dropped to the envelope, then back to her face. Something had moved behind them. Not fear exactly, but the close relative of fear that lived in people who had spent a long time being immune to consequences and had just, for the first time, gotten a clear look at what consequences actually were. Tricia, he said. Holt was already making notes on her legal pad. Fast, precise. Whatever she was writing, it was not the meeting she had come here to conduct. Mara stood up. I'm going home to sleep, she said. I've been here 21 hours. When I come back tonight, I'd like the board to be in the same configuration it was when I arrived here 14 months ago. She picked up her bag, left the envelope on the table. You can keep that. She walked to the door. Behind her, Westbrook finally spoke. His first words since she'd entered the room, and they weren't directed at her. They were directed at Decker, quiet and careful, and with the cadence of a man stepping back from something he'd been standing too close to. Gerald, I need to talk to you after this. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She pushed through the door and walked to the elevator and stood inside it with her eyes closed as it descended. And in the lobby, she nodded to the security desk and walked out into the morning. The air outside was cold and damp, the kind of October morning that couldn't decide if it was done with summer. She stood on the sidewalk outside the main entrance and breathed it in and tried to feel the way she thought she should feel, some version of relieved or resolved or finished. What she felt instead was the particular exhaustion that followed sustained effort, the come down after the operational focus releases, and the body remembers it's been awake too long. Her phone rang. Reyes. How'd it go? He said. I'm not fired. That's not the same as it going well. No, she agreed. It's not. She watched a car pull in and out of the drop-off loop. He's going to move. Maybe not today, but he's going to move. Yeah? A pause. Webb wants to talk to you. He's been asking since 6 a.m. She looked at her watch, 7:51. I'll come up before I leave. Room 412 had the standard equipment and the particular smell of rooms where people had been for more than 3 days. Something institutional, and underneath it, something human. The layered presence of a person existing continuously in a small space. Marcus Webb was 61, broad through the shoulders even now, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades outdoors in conditions that didn't accommodate comfort. His left hand had an IV line. His eyes were clear and watchful, and not the eyes of someone the pulmonary infection had gotten the better of. He looked at Mara for a moment after she came in, the way people looked when they were assessing whether you were going to be straight with them. He's not going to let this go, Webb said. No preamble. His voice was rougher than she'd expected. Not from illness, she thought, but from something older. I know. I've been lying here for 5 days watching how this place runs. He shifted against the pillow. The third night, the woman in the room next to mine, 410, she coded at 2 a.m. I heard the whole thing through the wall, and then I heard it stop. Not because she stabilized. His jaw tightened. I asked the morning nurse about her. She said she'd been transferred. I asked where. She said she didn't know. His eyes didn't move from Mara's face. I've been in places. I know what transferred means when it's a lie. I know, she said again. So does Decker. She pulled the chair beside his bed and sat. Outside the window, the morning was turning gray-white, the particular flat light that preceded rain. The documentation you gave Reyes, she said. Is there anything in it about 410? Name, date, the times of what I heard. Webb's voice was steady. And the name of the nurse who was on that hall that night. She put in her resignation the next week. I wrote that down too. Where is she now? I don't know. Reyes is trying to find out. He looked at his hands for a moment. I should have done something sooner. I kept thinking. I kept waiting until I had more. Enough. There's never enough when the other side has everything. She understood that specific wait. She didn't offer comfort about it, because Webb was not a man who wanted comfort. He wanted honesty. You did something, she said. 8 months. That's not nothing. He nodded once, not in relief. In acknowledgement. Her phone buzzed. Sandra Okafor again. The message was 4 words. They pulled the security footage. She stared at it. Then, below it, a second message arrived. Same sender, 10 seconds later. Not just last night. All of it. 3 months back. The server room was accessed at 6 a.m. this morning. Building logs show Decker's head of facilities. Mara set the phone face down on her knee. Webb was watching her. Something happened, he said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. She turned the phone back over and read it again, making sure she had it right. 3 months of security footage. Gone. Everything that showed what the building had actually looked like. The movements, the decisions, the night in room 410, reduced to a gap in the record that the Decker group could fill with whatever narrative they needed. They're cleaning house, she said. How fast? Fast enough that someone was in the server room before 8 a.m. Webb was quiet for a moment. Then, the notebook isn't the only thing I kept. She looked at him. He reached under the mattress, a movement that cost him something. She could see it in the set of his jaw, and produced a small black device. A thumb drive, the kind that could fit in a closed fist and look like nothing. I recorded 3 conversations, he said, in this room. Staff talking to each other through the door when they thought I was asleep. Names, specifics. He set it on the sheet between them. I know it's not admissible everywhere. I know that. But it's real. She looked at the drive. Reyes needs to have this, she said. That's why I waited for you to come up. He pushed it toward her. I figured if you walked out of that meeting, you were the right person to give it to. She picked it up, closed her hand around it. And if I hadn't walked out? The faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. Then I'd have given it to Reyes regardless. But I wanted you in the room when I handed it over. He leaned back and she could see the effort that the last 10 minutes had cost him. Not weakness, but the honest taxation of a sick man who had held himself upright for longer than his body wanted. Because you're the one they're trying to bury, and you deserve to know what you're holding. She closed her fingers around the drive. Her phone rang. Not a text, a call. Unknown number, different area code than the message last night. She looked at it for 1 ring, 2, then answered. A woman's voice, steady, controlled, but with something underneath it that had the quality of someone who had been holding themselves together for a long time and was very close to the edge of that effort. Is this Mara Voss? Yes. My name is Deanna Flores. I was a nurse at Hargrove Memorial until 4 months ago. A breath. I resigned from the night shift. 4th floor. Another pause, shorter this time, like she was deciding whether to continue and deciding yes. I've been trying to figure out who to call for 2 months. I found your name this morning through someone who said you might actually do something with what I know. Mara stood up from the chair. Tell me where you are, she said. Deanna Flores lived in a second-floor apartment in Garner, 20 minutes south of Raleigh, in the kind of building that had been constructed cheaply in the 90s and had been aging without investment since. The exterior staircase had a loose railing. The parking lot had two dead light fixtures. Mara noticed both automatically, the way she noticed everything that indicated whether a situation was maintained or neglected and what that said about the people inside it. She knocked at 8:40 a.m. Reyes was behind her, Cole at his left. She had called him from the hospital parking lot and said 4 words, "I need you with me," and he had not asked why. The woman who opened the door was 37, maybe 38, with dark circles that weren't from one bad night, but from the kind of sustained exhaustion that settled into the tissue around the eyes and stayed. She was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and she looked at Mara the way people looked when they had spent a long time being afraid to trust anyone and were now attempting it anyway and finding it physically uncomfortable. "You came fast," Deanna said. "You said 2 months of trying to figure out who to call." Mara held her gaze. "That's long enough." Deanna looked at Reyes, at Cole. Her expression shifted slightly. Not fear, but the reassessment that happened when a situation contained more variables than expected. "He's with me," Mara said. A beat. Then Deanna stepped back and let them in. The apartment was clean in the careful way of someone who controlled the things they could control. Small kitchen, a second-hand couch, a table with a laptop and papers spread across it that Deanna moved to stack when they came in, then stopped, reconsidered, and left where they were. On the kitchen counter, a coffee maker with a half-empty pot. The particular geography of someone living alone and working something through. They sat. Deanna wrapped both hands around a mug and looked at the table rather than at them, the posture of someone organizing internally before speaking externally. "Room 410, she said. Her name was Norma Restrepo, 73 years old. She came in for a cardiac catheterization follow-up. Routine monitoring. Should have been 2 days, maybe 3. She paused. She had Medicare. Supplemental coverage through her late husband's pension. Another pause. The billing on her account in the week before she died ran to about $94,000. I know that because I saw the file by accident when the system was open on the charge nurse's terminal, and I wasn't supposed to be looking at it. Mara didn't move. What was she billed for? Procedures that weren't in the chart. A second imaging sequence that I never saw ordered. IV medications on days when her chart showed oral-only administration. And a specialist consultation from a Dr. Harlan Briggs. She looked up. Dr. Briggs retired in 2021. His license lapsed. He hasn't been credentialed anywhere in 3 years. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sound of a car on the street outside. "When you say she died," Mara started. "She coded at 1:58 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was on the floor. I was the one who called it." Deanna's voice was steady, but the steadiness was constructed, the way a levee was constructed, under pressure, from the outside. "The resuscitation lasted 11 minutes. Dr. Westbrook called it. He said the outcome was expected given her cardiac history." She set down the mug. "Her cardiac history was well managed. Her ejection fraction 6 weeks earlier had been 52%. That's not a woman who should have coded on night 3 of a monitoring admission." "What were her vitals in the hours before?" "That's the thing." Deanna pulled one of the papers from the stack she'd half reorganized and pushed it across the table. Her documented vitals were stable. Q4 checks, all within normal range, right up until the code call. She tapped the paper. "But I was on that floor. I checked her at midnight. Not my patient, but I was passing the room and the door was open and she looked wrong to me. Not alarmingly wrong, just off. A little more fatigued than she'd seemed at dinner. I mentioned it to the charge nurse. And? She said Norma was fine, that she'd just checked her, and that I should focus on my own patients." Deanna's jaw tightened. 2 hours later, she coded. Reyes had been silent since they'd sat down. He spoke now quietly. "Was there a nursing note documenting your observation at midnight?" "No. The charge nurse said she'd note it. I assumed she did." Deanna's eyes went briefly to something in the middle distance. "After Norma died, I went back and looked at the chart. Nothing. Not my observation, not a corresponding reassessment. The midnight entry was a standard vitals check. Numbers in normal range. She looked at Mara directly. Someone entered those numbers after the fact. I don't know how to prove that, but I know it's true because I was there. Mara looked at the paper. It was a handwritten timeline. Dates, times, names, observations, the kind of document a person made when they needed to get something out of their head and onto a surface where it couldn't be argued away. 4 pages, small handwriting, consistent. The week after she died, Deanna continued, a man came to speak with me. He wasn't HR. He introduced himself as a consultant with the Decker Group's administrative division. He said there had been some concern about staff conduct on the night of the incident and that they were reviewing how information was being handled. He used that word, handled. She picked up the mug again, just to have something to hold. He told me that my comments to the charge nurse about Norma Restrepo that night had created an unnecessary documentation issue, and that going forward, concerns about patients outside my direct care assignment should be routed through formal channels only, and that informal observations not documented in the chart created liability. He was telling you to stop talking, Reyes said. He was telling me that what I'd seen hadn't happened the way I remembered it. She set the mug down. I have a brother with 2 kids and a mortgage I co-signed. I know what that means. I know what it means when someone with a Decker Group business card sits across from you and talks about liability. She looked at Mara. I handed in my notice 10 days later. I told myself I'd figure out what to do from outside. And then 2 months passed and I kept thinking someone else would do it. Someone with more standing, more protection. Someone who couldn't be made into a nobody. The room held that for a moment. Mara thought about Jalen Torres in recovery. She thought about Marcus Webb under his hospital blanket with a thumb drive he'd hidden under a mattress. She thought about the security footage that had been erased at 6 in the morning by a man who worked facilities for the Decker Group, and she thought about how many versions of someone else will do it had been necessary for things to get this far. You're not a nobody, she said. It wasn't comfort. It was a statement of operational fact. You're a licensed nurse with direct observational knowledge of events in that room. Your testimony is the difference between a financial fraud case and a patient death case. She held Deanna's eyes. Those are not the same thing in front of a federal prosecutor. Something shifted in Deanna's posture, not resolution exactly, not the clean turn of a decision made, something messier than that. The particular movement of someone who had been carrying weight for a long time and was beginning with effort to set it down. What do you need from me? She said. Everything you just told us, in writing, with dates, and anything else you have, texts, emails, anything from the Decker Group consultant or anyone else at the hospital after Norma died. Mara looked at the handwritten timeline. Can I take this? It's a copy. I have the original. Deanna pushed the papers across the table. I've been making copies of everything for 2 months. I have a folder. She stood and went to the kitchen, opened a cabinet above the refrigerator, and produced a manila envelope thick enough to have significant contents. She held it for a moment before she handed it over. I need you to understand something, she said. If this goes somewhere and my name is on it, my brother can't lose that house. If something happens to my license, we're not at the point where I can promise you anything specific, Mara said honestly. What I can tell you is that whistleblower protections for healthcare workers under federal statute are real and enforceable, and that the person I'm working with has connections to people who know how to use them. She nodded at Reyes. He's not a lawyer, but he knows which lawyers to call. Deanna looked at Reyes again. A longer look this time, the kind that was trying to read something beyond the surface. What are you? She said to him. He answered simply, someone who's been in situations where the right information got to the right people and the outcome was different than it would have been otherwise. A pause. That's what I do. It wasn't a complete answer. It was an honest one. Deanna handed over the envelope. Done. They were back on the interstate by 9:30, Reyes driving, Cole in the rear, Mara with the manila envelope on her lap and the thumb drive in her jacket pocket, and the handwritten timeline folded on top of everything else. The rain that had been threatening since morning had arrived, not heavy, but persistent, the kind that settled in and intended to stay. How solid is your federal contact, she said. Solid enough that I texted him at 4 a.m. and he responded by 5. Reyes kept his eyes on the road. He's with the HHS Office of Inspector General, Healthcare Fraud Division. He owes me something from a situation in 2019 that I can't explain here. A beat. He's competent and he's careful. He's not going to move until he has enough. How much is enough? More than we had at 4 a.m., probably less than what we have now. He checked the mirror. The billing records are the backbone. Federal Medicare fraud is a hard charge. It doesn't require intent to be proven for every individual claim, just a pattern and knowledge. What Deanna described about Briggs's inactive license on a billing code is not a paperwork error. That's knowing falsification. Norma Restrepo's death. That's harder. The billing fraud can be prosecuted without proving anyone directly caused a death. But if the OIG opens the fraud case, the medical examiner's file on Norma gets reviewed automatically. That's how it works. The financial investigation opens the door to everything else. He paused. Provided nobody else touches the records before then. Mara looked out at the rain. Decker knows we have something, she said. He doesn't know exactly what. But he spent the morning pulling security footage, which means he's already in damage control mode. She thought about his face in the conference room, the stillness, the recalibration. He's going to move faster than we thought, probably. What does fast look like for someone like him? Reyes was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the quality of the silence as him running through something he actually knew rather than something he was guessing at. Someone like Decker has 3 tools. Money, which he's already started spending. Narrative control, which is why the footage is gone. He's building a version of events he can defend. And pressure on individuals. He glanced at her briefly. Not physical, legal, financial, license reviews. Defamation claims that cost money to fight even when you win, making it expensive enough to continue that most people stop. He already tried the first one with me. Last night was improvised. This morning was more organized. The next move will be more organized still. She turned the manila envelope over in her hands. How long do we have before he figures out what we're actually holding? He knows about Webb. Probably not about Deanna yet. A pause. Once he knows about Deanna, the clock gets shorter. Then we need your OIG contact to open a formal inquiry before Decker's lawyers can position this as a dispute between a terminated employee and her former employer. I know. He took the exit toward Raleigh. I'm meeting him at noon. She looked at him. You already set that up. I set it up before you walked out of that conference room. He said it without apology. I wanted options available regardless of how the meeting went. She should have found that presumptuous. She found it instead the first thing that had felt structurally sound since she'd walked out of the hospital 2 hours ago. Not because she needed someone to act on her behalf. She didn't and wouldn't have tolerated it if that had been the dynamic. But because Reyes was operating the way people operated when they were actually trying to solve a problem, rather than manage their own involvement in it. What do you need me to do between now and noon? She said. Sleep. That's not... You've been awake for 23 hours. You have a bruised shoulder from last night that you haven't mentioned since it happened, but that I can see in how you're sitting. He kept his voice even. You're going to need to be functional later. Sleep for 3 hours. I'll handle the noon meeting and call you after. She wanted to argue. The argument assembled itself. She was fine, she could push through, there were things that needed doing, and then it dissolved because she recognized it as the exact kind of refusal to acknowledge that she'd seen get people hurt in contexts where the margins were tighter than this. Being awake for 23 hours didn't make you sharp. It made you feel sharp while actually degrading every metric that mattered. 3 hours, she said. 3 hours. Done. She woke at 12:47 p.m. to 4 missed calls and a text from Reyes that said, "Call me when you're up." It moved faster than expected. She called him while still sitting on the edge of the bed, her shoulders stiff now in the way that bruises were stiffer when they'd had time to settle. The OIG contact's name is Frank Adler, Reyes said, without preamble. He's been running a parallel inquiry into the Decker Group for 6 weeks. Different entry point. A whistleblower complaint from a billing coder at their Charlotte affiliate hospital filed in August. He didn't have enough to move on. What we brought him this morning crossed his threshold. She was fully awake now. He's opening a formal investigation. He opened it at 11:53. There's a federal subpoena being prepared for Hargrove's financial records, billing history, and procurement documentation going back 30 months. A pause. He wants Deanna Flores contacted through formal channels today. He wants Webb's thumb drive authenticated. Another pause, shorter. And he wants you. For what? Your direct observations as a clinical staff member, the triage records from last night, the documentation irregularities you flagged on the supply requisitions. Reyes's voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not urgency exactly, but the specific tension of a situation that had become real in the way that possibilities, when they actualized, became heavier than they were in the abstract. He wants a statement, today, if possible. She looked at the window. The rain was still going. Where? His office is in Durham. I can take you. Has Decker been notified? A federal investigation doesn't notify the subject before serving the subpoena. A beat. But Adler thinks Decker's legal team may already be aware that something is moving. He's seen it before. People with resources who have alert networks inside regulatory agencies. Not corruption necessarily. Just people who know people who hear things. He paused. Which means the timeline between now and the subpoena being served is the window where Decker could move to destroy additional records, pressure witnesses, or create legal obstacles. How long is that window? Adler thinks they can have the subpoena served by end of business today. Maybe 6 hours. 6 hours. She thought about Deanna Flores in her apartment in Garner, the loose railing on the exterior staircase, the 2 months of accumulated fear. She thought about Webb on the 4th floor with an IV line, in a building still controlled by the Decker Group, where the nursing staff who worked his hall reported ultimately to people who had just spent the morning erasing video footage. Webb needs to be moved, she said. Silence on the line. She could hear him thinking. He's medically admitted, Reyes said. He's ambulatory. His pulmonary infection is responding to antibiotics. His attending said he could potentially be cleared for outpatient treatment in 24 to 48 hours. If we make the case to his physician today, get him discharged and transferred to a different facility. She stood up, moving as she thought. He's not safe in that building. Not now that Decker knows he exists. His attending is Hargrove's staff. His attending is Dr. Patricia Sewell. She has no administrative connection to the Decker Group. She's a pulmonologist with a private practice affiliation. She uses Hargrove for admissions because of the equipment. Mara was already pulling on her shoes. I know her. Not well, but I know her. She'll listen to a clinical argument. What's the clinical argument? That a patient recovering from a pulmonary infection is experiencing significant psychological stress in his current environment that is a genuine contraindication to optimal recovery, and that his physician and care team believe transferring to an alternative facility would be in his best medical interest. She paused. It's not fabricated. It's true. And Sewell knows how to read between lines when lines need reading. Reyes was quiet for a second. When do you want to do this? Now, before we go to Durham. She picked up her jacket. If I'm giving a statement to a federal investigator this afternoon, I need to know Webb is out of that building. Patricia Sewell had an office on the 2nd floor of Hargrove's outpatient wing, a different building from the main tower, connected by a glass walkway that Mara had used maybe a dozen times. The separation was architectural, but it mattered. Sewell's professional footprint at Hargrove was clinical, not administrative. She was not in the org chart of anyone who reported to Gerald Decker. She was 50, compact, with reading glasses she kept pushing up and then forgetting about, and she listened to Mara for 6 minutes without interrupting, which was a form of respect that Mara had learned not to take for granted. You're telling me my patient is in danger, Sewell said when Mara finished. Not a question, an assessment. I'm telling you there are people in this building who have a significant interest in whether Marcus Webb talks to federal investigators, and that his current location makes him accessible to those people in ways that concern me. Mara kept her voice clinical. His infection is improving. You know his numbers better than I do. I'm asking whether he could be safely transitioned to outpatient IV antibiotics at a different facility. Sewell took her glasses off entirely and set them on the desk. Clinically, he's borderline. Another 24 hours of observation would be my preference. I understand that. But my preference is not the only consideration. She looked at Mara steadily. You're not wrong about the building. She said it quietly, like she was setting something down carefully. I've been here 11 years. I've seen things get managed in ways that bothered me, and I told myself it wasn't my area and kept my head in my lane. A pause. Is this the moment where that stops being a reasonable position? I think so, Mara said. Sual picked up the phone. She arranged the transfer in 22 minutes. Rex UNC Health, which had a solid pulmonology unit and was in no way affiliated with the Decker Group. She called Webb's room directly to explain the transition. Mara stood outside the office in the glass walkway and watched the rain on the roof of the parking structure below and waited. When Sewell opened the door again, she said, "Transport in 90 minutes. I'm discharging him with outpatient IV protocol and a follow-up order at Rex." She looked at Mara. He sounded relieved. "Thank you," Mara said. "Don't thank me. Just make sure it matters." Otik. Reyes was waiting in the parking lot with the engine running. Cole was in the back. Mara got in, and they were moving before she had fully closed the door. "Webb's being transferred in 90 minutes, she said. "Rex UNC. Good." He checked his mirror. "Adler's office at 2:30. That gives us time." The drive to Durham was 40 minutes. They were 20 minutes out when Mara's phone rang. Not a text, a call, from a number she recognized as Sandra Okafor's desk line. She answered. Sandra's voice was different from the pre-shift messages. Lower, compressed. The sound of someone speaking quietly in a space where they might be overheard. "There's a meeting happening right now," Sandra said. "Third floor again. Decker, Holt, and 2 men I don't recognize. Not hospital staff. Someone from facilities told me one of them has a federal marshal's office background." She paused. "And Ryan Decker came in 20 minutes ago. He's in the building." Mara looked at Reyes. He was listening. She'd put it on speaker after the first sentence. "What's the tone of the meeting?" Mara said. "I can't get near it. But Westbrook came out of it 20 minutes ago and went straight to his office and closed the door, which he never does." Sandra's breath was careful, controlled. "Something is happening, Mara. I don't know if it's good or bad." "It might be both," Mara said. A silence. Then Sandra said, "There's something else." Another pause, longer this time. The kind where the person on the other end is deciding how to say a thing. Ryan was stopped at the main entrance by building security. They weren't our security. 2 men in plain clothes. They asked him to wait. Her voice dropped further. "He's still down there. He looked scared." Mara stared at the windshield. Federal investigators moved without notifying subjects. Adler had said the subpoena would be served by end of business. It was 1:40 p.m. "Sandra," she said, "I need you to do one thing." "What?" "Stay away from the 3rd floor for the rest of the afternoon." She paused. "And if anyone asks where I am, you don't know." She ended the call. Reyes didn't say anything. He took the next on-ramp at the same speed he'd been driving all morning, and Cole in the back made no sound, and the rain kept coming, and Mara sat with her hands flat on her thighs and tried to organize the variables. The subpoena was moving faster than Adler had projected. That was good. That was the thing that mattered, but Ryan Decker was in the building, and whatever was happening on the 3rd floor, Gerald Decker was there with lawyers who had a federal background, and that meant he'd had the same alert network Adler had described. The people who heard things, and he was not waiting. Her phone buzzed. Not a call. A message. From a number she had never seen before, no name attached. She read it once. Read it again. "We know about Flores. We know about the thumb drive. You have until 5 p.m. to return what you took from the 4th floor and walk away from this. After that, we pursue every legal avenue available to us, and your former employers will be contacted." Former employers, not Hargrove. Before Hargrove. The federal contract that wasn't on her official file. The work she couldn't discuss. She looked at the message for 4 seconds. 5. Then she forwarded it to Reyes's number and to Frank Adler's number and typed one sentence beneath it. Received 1:43 p.m. This is witness intimidation. Logging for record. She set the phone down. "They found Deanna," she said. Reyes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. How fast can we get her somewhere safe? Call her, now. Mara was already dialing Adler. Tell her to leave the apartment. Don't pack, just leave. The line to Adler connected on the second ring. We have a problem, she said. Adler's voice on the other end was measured, the voice of someone who had been in federal work long enough that problem had lost most of its power to alarm him. Tell me, she told him. A pause, short, precise. The subpoena serves in 40 minutes, he said. I moved the timeline up an hour ago when your partner texted me about the footage erasure. Another pause. Ms. Flores needs to be with us. Not tomorrow, not tonight. Now. Can you get her here? We're 20 minutes from your office. Make it 15, Adler said. And Voss, whoever sent you that message, just handed us an obstruction charge on top of everything else. His voice was still level, but something underneath it had hardened. Don't let that make you careless. These people have resources and they're scared. Scared people with resources are not predictable. I know, she said. I know you know. A beat. 15 minutes. She ended the call. Reyes had already dialed Deanna. The phone rang once, twice, and Mara's chest tightened on the third ring, the particular bodily response to a variable going uncontrolled. And then Deanna answered, slightly breathless, like she'd run to get the phone. Someone just knocked on my door, Deanna said immediately. I didn't answer. I looked through the peephole. 2 men, suits. They haven't left. Reyes said, Is there a back exit from your apartment? The kitchen window goes to a fire escape. It faces the alley. Take it. Leave everything except your phone. Go to the alley and walk north. I'll tell you where to go from there. A silence. 2 seconds. 3. And Mara could hear in it the entirety of the weight that Deanna had been carrying, the 2 months of doubt, the fear for her brother, the years of training that said trust institutions, the experience of the last 4 months that had dismantled that trust piece by piece. Okay, Deanna said, the sound of a window being opened. Reyes accelerated. The rain came down harder, and ahead of them the Durham skyline sat low and gray against the October sky. And somewhere behind them a federal subpoena was moving toward a building with a man's name on the east wing, and Mara sat in the passenger seat with a thumb drive in her pocket and a bruised shoulder, and the message still open on her phone screen. And she thought about Norma Restrepo, 73 years old, who had come in for a routine monitoring admission and had coded on night 3, and whose chart had entries time-stamped at hours when nothing honest could have generated them. Reyes's phone buzzed against the cup holder. He glanced at it. His expression didn't change, but something in the quality of his stillness did. The particular quality she'd learned to read in the hours since the ER floor, the shift that happened when new information arrived and the variables reconfigured. What? She said. He handed her the phone. The message was from a number saved as M. Webb. 3 words. They moved me early. Not 90 minutes. Not through the proper transport Sewell had arranged. Early. Mara stared at the screen. Sewell arranged Rex UNC, she said. Transport in 90 minutes. That was 40 minutes ago. I know. Reyes's voice was completely flat. She looked up. That's not the transport Sewell ordered. No, he said. It's not. Her hand closed around the phone. The rain hit the windshield in long diagonal lines, and the wipers moved back and forth with the rhythmic indifference of machines. And somewhere in a vehicle she couldn't identify, Marcus Webb, who had spent 8 months writing down the things he'd seen because he'd learned in a different life that documentation was the closest thing to survival, was being taken somewhere that was not Rex UNC Health. And she did not know where. Reyes took the next exit without being told to. That was the thing about people who had operated in genuinely bad situations. They didn't wait for consensus when the geometry of a problem was clear. Webb had been moved early, which meant someone inside Hargrove had either overridden Sewell's transport order or fabricated one alongside it, and the window between when that happened and when Webb arrived somewhere, Decker's people controlled was closing at the speed of whatever vehicle he was in. He texted, Mara said, which means he has his phone. For now. She was already calling him back. 1 ring, 2, 3. Then the click of connection. Webb. His voice was low, slightly unsteady, not from fear, she thought, but from the specific instability of a sick man in a moving vehicle he hadn't chosen to be in. Where are you? Can you see anything? Highway. Interstate, I think. We went south on Saunders, then a ramp. A breath. Two men in the front. They showed me a transport order. Had the hospital letterhead, had Sewell's name on it. I didn't check the badge number. A pause, and in it she heard the particular self-recrimination of a trained person who had been caught in a moment of trusting the wrong thing. I should have checked the badge number. It doesn't matter. What else can you see? White van. No hospital markings. The transport vehicles at Hargrove are marked. Another breath. I know I should have. Webb. Focus. Is there a highway sign? Silence for 4 seconds. 5. I-40 West, he said. We just passed the Wade Avenue exit. Reyes had already pulled over, engine running, his phone in hand pulling up a map. His thumb moved fast and precise. Wade Avenue to I-40 West, he said. Not to her, running it out loud. 20 minutes out, that puts them toward Cary, Morrisville, the RDU corridor. He looked at the map. Or they're not going to a facility at all. They're running him to a staging point. Stay on the line, as she told Webb. Don't make it obvious you're on the phone. Keep the phone in your hand, but down. I'm not new at this, Webb said, with the ghost of something dry in his voice that under different circumstances she would have appreciated more. She lowered the phone and looked at Reyes. Adler. Already texting him. We need a location trace on the vehicle. If Adler can get... He can't do a trace in real time without a warrant, and the warrant takes... Then we need to stay close enough to track it ourselves. She looked at the map on his phone. Wade Avenue exit. We're 10 minutes behind them. Reyes pulled back onto the road. She kept the line to Webb open, low volume, phone held loose, and listened to the ambient sound of the van's interior, road noise, the low murmur of a radio in the front, Webb's controlled breathing. He was managing. He was keeping himself together. She had no way to tell him that she had this under control because she didn't yet, and he would know the difference between honesty and performance. Reyes drove. The rain had eased to a gray mist, the kind that didn't fall so much as exist, present in the air, softening the edges of the highway and the tree lines along the shoulders. Mara watched exit signs and thought about what Decker's people needed from Webb. The notebook was already out of the building. The photos were already sent. The thumb drive was in her jacket pocket. Whatever they thought they were securing by moving him, the information had already left, which meant this wasn't about the information anymore. It was about the witness. A witness who could testify to 8 months of direct observation, who could describe the night Norma Restrepo's chart went quiet while her body told a different story, whose credibility came from a career that had nothing to do with hospital administration and everything to do with paying attention in difficult places. A retired sergeant whose testimony a federal jury would likely find more difficult to dismiss than a nurse who could be painted as disgruntled, or a former employee who could be painted as vengeful. Decker didn't need to destroy the documents anymore. The subpoena would get the documents. What he needed was to put Webb somewhere inaccessible for long enough that the federal investigation had to proceed without him. Long enough for lawyers to establish alternative narratives, long enough for the picture to become incomplete. She brought the phone back up. Webb, I need you to do something uncomfortable. Tell me. I need you to cause a problem, something medical, not serious but visible, enough that they have to respond. She kept her voice steady. Can you do that? A pause. She heard him think. My oxygen sat has been running low normal since yesterday, he said. If I exert myself, it'll drop. That'll set off my monitor alarm if I can get it to read. A beat. They brought the portable monitor. It's on the bench beside me. How much exertion? Couple minutes of shallow breathing, tensing the wrong muscles. I've watched patients do it accidentally often enough. He paused. It'll feel bad. I know. Can you handle it? Can you get there in time? She looked at Reyes. He was watching the road and had heard everything. Tell me when you're starting, Reyes said without looking away from the highway. Webb said, starting now. The monitor alarm, a portable pulse ox unit, she heard the specific three-tone pattern through the phone, triggered 90 seconds later. She heard the van slow, heard voices in the front, sharp and uncertain, the particular vocal quality of people running a script who had just hit a line that wasn't in it. One of them said, "Pull over," and the other said something she couldn't catch, and then there was the deceleration of a vehicle leaving highway speed. "They're stopping," Webb said, very low, and she heard strain in his breathing that was not entirely performance anymore. "I see it," Reyes said. She looked up. A quarter-mile ahead on the shoulder, the white van was pulling over, hazards coming on. Reyes accelerated, then modulated. Not pulling up too fast, not announcing arrival. He took the next lane and cruised past the van at 45 miles an hour, and as they passed, Mara turned her head and read the plate number and texted it to Adler in 4 seconds. "Got it," Reyes said. He took the next exit ramp, looped, came back on the service road that ran parallel to the interstate shoulder. The van was visible through the mist, pulled up on the gravel strip, hazards blinking amber in the gray light, both front doors open. One of the men was at the rear of the van. The other was on his phone. Reyes stopped on the service road with the tree line between them and the van and killed the headlights. "How's your SAT?" she said into the phone. 87, a strained breath. "They're arguing. One wants to call for a medic." "Good. Keep breathing shallow, not too shallow." "I know how to breathe, Voss." She watched through the mist and the tree gap. The man on the phone had turned away from the van, which was the body language of someone being reprimanded by the voice on the other end of that call. The second man was at the van's rear doors, which were now open, and he was leaning in with what looked like the monitor. Her phone buzzed. Adler. Plady is registered to a Shell LLC, Meridian Transport Solutions, incorporated 8 months ago. Registered agent is a law firm that has worked for Decker Group subsidiaries on 4 prior occasions. This is not a licensed medical transport company, she showed Reyes. He read it and said, "That's kidnapping under medical pretense. That's a federal charge on top of everything else. Adler needs to move now, not end of business. Now." She called him. Adler answered on the first ring. She read him the texts aloud, heard him exhale once, not surprise, more the sound of a man for whom something had just crystallized. "I can get a federal marshal to that location in 11 minutes, he said. "I need you to keep him in place. The van is stopped. Medical situation. Keep it stopped." A brief pause. "Voss, do not approach that vehicle yourself." She looked at the van, 40 meters. The 2 men were both at the rear now, which meant Webb was visible to them, and they were managing the monitor, and nobody was looking at the service road. "I know," she said. She ended the call, kept watching. 3 minutes passed, then 4. The man who'd been on the phone had closed it and was now standing with his arms crossed in the particular posture of someone waiting to be told what to do and not enjoying the experience. The other man, closer to the van, to Webb, said something that carried in the damp air, but not clearly enough to parse. Cole, in the back seat, made the low sound he'd made in the hospital corridor. Present, attentive. At the 6-minute mark, a dark SUV pulled onto the shoulder ahead of the van, not from the highway, from the service road's far entrance, federal plates. 2 people out before it had fully stopped. One held credentials up as he approached the van, arm extended, unhurried in the way that real authority was unhurried because it didn't need speed to establish itself. The man with the crossed arms took 2 steps back. The second man at the van's rear straightened up and looked at the credentials and went very still. Mara let out a breath she hadn't fully registered holding. "Webb," she said, "federal marshals are at the vehicle. You're okay. Stay where you are." A pause. Then, "Copy that." His voice had the slightly compressed quality of someone whose oxygen was still lower than it should be, but underneath it something that had been held very tight was loosening. "Next time," he said, "maybe warn me before you use me as bait." "You suggested the plan?" "I suggested the mechanism. The bait part was implied." She said, "I'll buy you a bad cup of coffee from a hospital vending machine when this is over." "That's the worst reward I've ever heard." I know. They got Webb to Rex UNC by 3 p.m. through the front door, with a federal marshal present for the admission and a note in his file that his room number was not to be disclosed to anyone outside his immediate treatment team. Sewall had called ahead from Hargrove. The pulmonology resident who admitted him was thorough and young, and looked at the marshal in the doorway with the careful professionalism of someone who had decided not to ask questions they didn't need answers to. Webb shook Mara's hand before she left, not an emotional gesture, more like a transaction completed. Recognition between two people who had run a task together and come out the other side of it. "The notebook," he said. "The audio files. Make sure they're used." "They will be." He nodded once. Lay back against the pillow. He looked, she thought, about 10 years older than he had in the Hargrove room, and also somehow less burdened, which was the specific paradox of people who had been carrying something for a long time and had finally transferred the weight. She was in the hallway, walking toward the elevator, when her phone rang. Sandra Okafor. She answered without stopping. "The subpoena was served at 2:47 p.m., Sandra said. Her voice had a quality Mara hadn't heard from her before. Not relief, not triumph. Something more complicated than either. The sound of someone watching something they'd been watching for a long time finally began to move. 4 federal agents, 3rd floor. They walked into the conference room while Decker was still in it. Mara stopped walking. "He's still in the building?" "He's in the building. His lawyers are on the 3rd floor. I saw 2 of them in the hallway. They were on their phones. One of them looked..." Sandra paused. "I've seen that look on lawyers before. It's the look they get when they realize the size of what's coming doesn't match what they were told to prepare for." "Ryan?" "He was detained at the entrance for about 40 minutes, then released. They let him go, but they took his phone. He left the building." A pause. "He didn't look like himself. He looked like someone who had just understood something." Mara started walking again, slower. "Sandra, how are you?" A silence. Not long. 5 seconds, maybe, but with weight in it. "I've been at this hospital for 16 years, Sandra said. "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know how wrong." Her voice was controlled, but the control was doing work. Norma Restrepo. "I remember her. She had a daughter who called every day at noon. The daughter asked me once, in the week after, she asked me if there was anything the staff could have done differently." Another pause. "I told her no, because I didn't know. And now You didn't know," Mara said. "That's different from choosing not to." "Is it?" "Yes." She meant it. "Call me if anything else moves. You've been... Sandra, you've been someone I could count on through all of this. That matters." A quiet exhale. "Just make it count," Sandra said, and hung up. Wub. The OIG field office in Durham occupied the 4th floor of a federal building that looked like every federal building. Deliberate anonymity, drop ceilings, the smell of filtered air, and institutional carpet. Frank Adler was 55, wore his age in his posture rather than his face, and had the specific patience of someone who had built cases slowly and carefully for 3 decades and understood that speed, in federal work, was usually how you handed the other side an exit. He shook Mara's hand and looked at her with the evaluating attention of someone who was deciding how to use what was in front of him. "The subpoena was broader than we initially filed," he said, once they were seated. "Once we had the Meridian transport information, we added a criminal obstruction component and expanded the document scope. We now have access to all procurement records, all billing submissions, all electronic health records in the relevant date range, and all communications between Decker Group administrative personnel and hospital staff." He set a folder on the table. "We also have a court order freezing a set of Decker Group accounts pending the investigation, which was granted at 2:15 this afternoon." Reyes, seated beside Mara, said, "Gerald Decker know about the freeze?" "His lawyers were notified simultaneously with the subpoena service." Adler's expression didn't change. "I imagine that conversation was informative for everyone present." Mara looked at the folder. "What do you need from me today?" "Your direct account, witnessed events, clinical decisions, the timeline of the Jalen Torres case, the specific procurement irregularities you documented in your charts." The encounter with Ryan Decker and what followed, and the sequence of events beginning with your contact with Sergeant Webb. He opened a recorder on the table. Old-fashioned, physical, the kind that produced an artifact that couldn't be edited retroactively. Everything in order. Take your time. She talked for an hour and 40 minutes. She was not a natural storyteller in the way people meant when they said that. She didn't reach for color or drama, didn't pace her delivery for effect. What she was accurate. She'd learned in environments where the difference between a precise account and an approximate one was the difference between an outcome and its opposite. She gave Adler dates, times, clinical measurements, direct quotations she was confident about, and paraphrased versions of the ones she wasn't, and she flagged the difference every time. She told him when she had observed something and when she had inferred it, and she never conflated the two. When she finished, Adler sat with his hands flat on the table for a moment. "The physician Westbrook," he said. "What's your read on him?" "He was in that conference room this morning," she said. "When I walked in, he couldn't hold eye contact. When I was leaving, he told Decker he needed to talk to him, privately." She thought about it. "He's not a villain. He's someone who looked away too many times and has been living with what that costs. Whether that means he'll cooperate or whether he'll lawyer up and protect himself, I don't know him well enough." "He called our office at 11 a.m. this morning," Adler said, "before the subpoena was served. He asked to speak with someone about making a voluntary disclosure." She absorbed that. "He saw which way it was moving," she said. "People often do when it starts moving." Adler closed his folder. "What you've given us today, combined with Flores's statement, which we took by phone this afternoon after she came in safely, and the physical documentation from Sergeant Webb, gives us a case that I would take to a grand jury with confidence." He looked at her steadily. "I want to be honest with you. This process takes time. The grand jury, the indictment, the prosecution. Months, realistically. Gerald Decker will be out on conditions during that time. He will have excellent lawyers. The defense will challenge every piece of evidence and call every witness's credibility into question." A pause. "Including yours." "I know. They'll find things. Everyone has things." "I know," she said again. He studied her. "You don't seem worried." "I'm worried," she said. "I'm just not surprised." She looked at the recorder. "Can I ask you something off the record?" He reached over and clicked it off. "Norma Restrepo's case," she said. "Is it prosecutable?" Adler was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant the answer was complicated and he was deciding how complicated to be with it. "The billing fraud is airtight," he said. "The false entries in the chart will need a forensic analyst to establish the timestamp irregularities, but that's standard. The causal connection between the falsified documentation and her death?" He paused. "That's the harder argument. It doesn't mean it won't be made. It means I need to be careful about how I make it, and I need a medical expert who can stand in front of a jury and explain exactly how a patient with a 52% ejection fraction codes on night 3 of a monitoring admission when her documented vitals showed stable throughout." "You'll find that expert," Mara said. "She deserves the harder argument." He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. "Yes," he said, "she does." It was past 5 when they left the federal building. The rain had stopped while they were inside, and the evening air had the cleaned-out quality that followed a day of precipitation. Cold, clear, specific. Mara stood on the sidewalk and felt the shift of the air against her face, and thought about nothing for about 30 seconds, which was the most genuine pause she'd taken in nearly 36 hours. Reyes appeared beside her. Cole sat between them on the sidewalk, looking down the street at nothing in particular. "Deanna is with her brother," he said. "His house, not hers. She's okay." "Good." "Webb is admitted and settled." A pause. "Adler's people are pulling the electronic records tonight. They'll have preliminary findings on the billing codes by tomorrow morning." "Also good." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "Tonight? Sleep?" She looked at the sky above the building line, where the last of the day's gray was converting slowly to evening. "Tomorrow I'm going back to work." "Hargrove?" "I'm still employed there, as of this morning." She looked at him. "The board will move on Decker's administrative position once the indictment comes. That could take months. Until then, there are still patients on that floor who need nurses. She paused. And there are staff who watched what happened last night and did nothing, and they have to keep working beside me, and I'd rather they have to do that than let any of them think they ran me out. Reyes looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the hospital corridor on the 4th floor that morning. The evaluating attention of someone who had revised their model upward. That's either very principled or very stubborn, he said. Probably both. The corner of his mouth moved. Probably. She thought about asking him something. What happened next for him? What the Federal Task Force contact meant, whether he was going to stay in Raleigh or whether this had been a detour in something else. She didn't ask because the shape of those answers felt like a conversation for a different time, when the situation had resolved enough to have a conversation that wasn't entirely operational. Instead, she said, "Thank you for the ER last night, for the 4 a.m. photos, for all of it." He looked at her steadily. "Don't thank me yet. It's not over." "I know." She picked up her bag. But I wanted to say it while it still felt like something worth saying. She walked toward the parking structure. Behind her, Cole made the low sound, attentive, present. And she heard Reyes's footsteps fall in beside hers without being asked, because that was the kind of person he was, and she didn't tell him to stop. The next 72 hours moved in the specific rhythm of a situation that had crested and was now descending. Not cleanly, not without friction, but with the particular irreversibility of things that had already happened. The forensic accountants Adler's team brought in established, within 18 hours of accessing Hargrove's billing system, 43 discrete instances of fraudulent Medicare claims spanning 22 months. The inactive license of Dr. Harlan Briggs appeared on 11 of them. Procurement records showed that medical supplies billed to patient accounts had been redirected through Meridian Transport Solutions, the same Shell LLC that had manufactured Webb's fake transfer order, to a secondary warehouse facility registered to a Gerald Decker family trust. The numbers, when the financial analysts totaled them, came to slightly over $4 million. The forensic analyst Adler brought in for the electronic health records spent 14 hours with the server data and produced a 40-page technical report establishing that 9 patient chart entries had been backdated, using a system administrator credential that had been issued to a member of Hargrove's IT department who had resigned 7 months ago. The technical evidence was not glamorous. It would not play dramatically in a courtroom. It was also, Adler told Mara on the phone, the kind of evidence that defense attorneys could not argue against because it was not interpretation. It was metadata, timestamps, system logs, the digital equivalent of a photograph. Norma Restrepo's chart contained 3 backdated entries. Westbrook gave a voluntary disclosure statement that ran to 61 pages. Mara didn't read it. It wasn't her document to read. But Adler told her in the precise language of someone choosing his words carefully that the statement confirmed and expanded the investigative picture in ways that would be relevant at the grand jury stage. He said it without satisfaction in his voice, which she respected. On the 3rd day, Gerald Decker was arrested at his home in North Hills at 7:15 in the morning. The image, captured by a neighbor's security camera and released by someone, Mara never found out who, to a local news station, showed him in the driveway in a gray jacket, 2 federal agents on either side, neither touching him. All 3 of them walking toward a vehicle with a controlled and specific dignity that was somehow worse than cuffs would have been. He looked, in the image, like a man who had known this was coming and had decided how he wanted to look when it arrived, and the effort of that decision was visible in his posture. Ryan was arrested 4 hours later at a condominium in downtown Raleigh. His girlfriend, the same woman whose minor hand laceration had been the genesis of the previous Thursday's events, was photographed in the building lobby looking at her phone, and whatever she saw on the screen kept her staring at it for a long time. Sandra Okafor called Mara at 8 a.m. "It's on the news," she said. "I know." "The staff," a pause. It's complicated. Some people are upset. Not at you. At themselves, I think. At how long they worked here without seeing it clearly." Another pause. "Deb Holloway cried in the break room. She doesn't cry. She told me. She said she saw things she should have flagged years ago and she didn't, and she needs to live with that." Sandra's voice was careful. I think a lot of people here need to live with that. Living with it is different from being responsible for it, Mara said. Is it? She'd asked that before. Mara gave her the same answer she'd given then, and meant it the same way. Yes, she said. It is. She went to work that evening. Night shift. The ER was the same ER. The same linoleum, the same monitors, the same particular quality of fluorescent light that turned everything slightly clinical even before anything clinical happened. Ty was at the security desk. He looked at her for a moment when she came in, and then he nodded. A deliberate nod, the kind that carried acknowledgement without knowing how to express it more specifically. And she nodded back and went to the locker room. Deb Holloway was at the nursing station when Mara took her position at the board. They stood side by side for a moment. Deb was looking at the intake log. Mara was updating the status column. Jalen Torres was discharged this afternoon, Deb said, without looking up. I know. I saw the note. Her aunt came to get her. A pause. She asked about you at discharge. By name. Mara didn't say anything. I told her you weren't on shift. Another pause. She left her number for you. It's in the chart notes. Okay. Mara looked at the board. Bay 2 was incoming. Laceration, non-critical. Bay 4 had a respiratory case that needed monitoring. The night was starting the way nights started, with a list of needs organized by urgency, and she was here to work through the list. Mara. Deb's voice was different, lower, more careful. I didn't step in. That night, when Ryan Decker, I know. That's not enough. I know it's not enough. She was looking at the board, not at Mara, and her jaw was set in the particular way of someone delivering something they'd been carrying. I've been a charge nurse for 14 years, and I stood there and calculated my own risk and let you take his. That's not something I can explain or fix. Mara was quiet for a moment. No, she said. It's not. She kept her eyes on the board. But you called Sandra when the meeting was called. You stayed in the building and you passed information. You didn't have to do that. She paused. People make different decisions in different moments. The question is what you do with the gap between them. Deb was quiet. Then, Bay 2 is pulling in. I see it. Mara picked up the chart. I've got it. She walked toward the bay entrance. The shift ran 9 hours without anything that qualified as unusual, which was to say that it ran with the standard density of a night ER, a child with a fishhook in his thumb, whose father was more distressed than he was, a woman in her 70s with a hypertensive episode that resolved with medication and monitoring, a construction worker with a hand injury that needed imaging, and a set of stitches that Mara placed herself when the resident was occupied. The rhythm of clinical work was its own kind of anchor. Not comfort exactly, but function. The forward momentum of one task completing and another beginning. At 4:30 a.m., in the brief gap between an intake and a transport, she sat at the nursing station with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm and looked at the message she'd saved. The 3-line text from the unknown number that had told her she had until 5 p.m. to walk away. She read it once. Then she went to her contacts, found Adler's number, and texted him to confirm he'd logged it as evidence. He replied in 4 minutes, which told her he was already awake. Logged and included in obstruction filing. Grand jury date is being set. You'll be notified. She set the phone down, picked up the next chart. The eastern sky, visible through the ambulance bay doors when they opened for an incoming, was beginning to show the particular gray-blue that preceded dawn. Not light yet, but the promise of it, the first concession of the dark to the coming day. She'd seen it hundreds of times from hospital doorways and field positions and places she still didn't talk about, and it never entirely lost its quality of being the simplest possible evidence that the night had not been permanent. At 6 a.m., she took her break in the vending machine alcove, the same alcove where she'd leaned against the wall and closed her eyes 4 nights ago while Reyes appeared from the elevator. She sat in the same spot, didn't close her eyes. Her phone showed a voicemail she hadn't noticed come in during the shift, left at 2:17 a.m. from a number she didn't recognize. She played it. A woman's voice, older, careful, speaking with the deliberateness of someone who had thought about what they wanted to say before they said it. My name is Patricia Decker, Gerald's wife. I think you know who I am by extension, though we've never met. A pause. I have been aware for some time that things at Hargrove were not what my husband described them to be. I want to be very clear. I am not calling to defend him. I'm calling because there are documents, financial records, internal communications that his legal team does not know I have access to. I've been collecting them for 14 months. Another pause. I've spoken with a lawyer. I'm prepared to cooperate fully with the federal investigation, but I wanted to speak with you first because from what I understand, you are the person who decided this mattered enough to not let it go. Her voice was steady through the whole message. I have a daughter. She has nothing to do with any of this. I need someone to know that before this becomes public in the ways it's about to. A final pause. My attorney's number is... Mara stopped the recording, sat with it for a long moment. Gerald Decker's wife. 14 months of documents. The same 14 months Mara had been at Hargrove, which was either coincidence or something that had a more complicated shape. She went back into her contacts and found Adler's number. Typed, "Call me when you're at your desk. There's something else." She hit send, set the phone down, looked at the vending machine, thought about Marcus Webb in his Rex UNC room, and Deanna Flores at her brother's house, and Jalen Torres discharged that afternoon with a surgical scar and a future she still had because a triage decision had held. Her phone buzzed. Not Adler, Reyes. The message said, Patricia Decker's lawyer contacted the OIG office at 2 a.m. Adler already knows. He wanted me to tell you before you heard it from someone else. She stared at the screen. Reyes had known. He'd known since at least 2 a.m. and had let her work the shift, had let her find the voicemail on her own time, had calculated that the information would hold, and she needed the hours more than she needed to know immediately. She typed back, "You could have texted me when it happened." His reply came in 30 seconds. "You were working. The building was secure. It could wait." She looked at that for a moment. Then, "What does her cooperation change?" The response took longer. She could see the indicator. He was typing, stopping, typing again. "It changes who knew what and when." The billing fraud had to be authorized at the ownership level. Gerald Decker could have argued delegation, that he didn't know the specifics. Patricia's documentation establishes direct knowledge, communications between him and the facility director about specific patient accounts. A pause, then one more line, including Norma Restrepo's. The alcove was quiet. The fluorescent tube overhead had been flickering since her first week at the hospital. Maintenance kept saying they'd replace it and never did. And it pulsed twice, 3 times in the silence, including Norma Restrepo. 14 months of documents from the wife who had watched and waited and built a record while her husband built his empire, and the record covered Norma Restrepo specifically, and whatever was in it had been enough that Patricia Decker had picked up the phone at 2 a.m. and called a nurse she'd never met. Mara set the phone down on her knee. She thought, 14 months. She had arrived at Hargrove 14 months ago. Patricia Decker had started collecting documents 14 months ago. That was not coincidence, and it wasn't something she could process fully at 6 a.m. after a 9-hour shift with the shape of it still unresolved, but it was something she would need to understand. She picked up the phone, dialed the number from the voicemail. It rang 4 times. Then Patricia Decker's voice, clearer now, more present than the recording, the voice of someone who had been awake and waiting. "Ms. Voss," she said. "Mrs. Decker." Mara kept her voice even. "I got your message. I thought you might call. I need to ask you something directly, and I need a direct answer." A pause. "All right. You started collecting documents 14 months ago." She paused. "What happened 14 months ago that made you start?" The silence on the line stretched. Not avoidance. She'd heard enough avoidance to know the difference. This was someone deciding whether to trust a stranger with something they'd been carrying alone. "A woman named Norma Restrepo," Patricia Decker said finally. "She was my friend. We met at the cardiac rehab program 4 years ago. Her husband had died the year before, and she was kind and sharp, and she called me every Sunday." A pause that had grief in it, the specific density of grief that had been compressed by time, but not diminished. "When she died in that hospital, Gerald told me it was expected. that her heart was worse than the test showed, that these things happen. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was doing visible work. And I wanted to believe him. For about 3 weeks, I wanted to believe him. And then I started thinking about what he'd said and the way he'd said it, and She stopped. "You knew," Mara said. "I knew something was wrong." A breath. "I didn't know how wrong until I started looking." Another pause. "Ms. Voss, Norma had no one left to fight for her. Her daughter was trying to get answers from hospital administration, and they were so smooth about it, so professionally kind. I sat in that woman's house and watched her daughter cry and accept an explanation that I knew wasn't true, and Her voice broke. Briefly, cleanly, and she brought it back. I didn't know what else to do except start writing things down. The fluorescent light above flickered once more and steadied. Mara closed her eyes. When she opened them, she said, "Mrs. Decker, I need you to be in Frank Adler's office today, not tomorrow. Today, with everything you have." She paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Patricia Decker said. "I've been ready for 14 months." Patricia Decker arrived at Adler's office at 10 a.m. with a rolling document case and a lawyer named Howard Finch, who had the quiet confidence of someone who had reviewed every page of what his client was carrying and understood exactly what it meant. She was 61, silver-haired, dressed simply, not the armor of a woman performing composure, but the clothing of someone who had already decided what they were doing and didn't need to perform anything. She shook Adler's hand and sat down and opened the document case. And the next 3 hours produced, in Adler's words when he called Mara that afternoon, the most complete financial and administrative record of institutional fraud he had seen in 22 years of federal work. The communications between Gerald Decker and the Hargrove facility director covered 31 months. They were specific. They used language that had been designed to be deniable in isolation and was not deniable in sequence. The Norma Restrepo account appeared in 4 separate messages: her name, her Medicare ID, her insurance coverage, and the phrase "manage the outcome" appearing in a context that a jury would not need a linguist to interpret. Adler convened the grand jury 11 days later. The proceedings were not public, which was how grand juries worked, which meant that what Mara knew of them, she knew from Adler's measured updates and from the particular quality of silence from Decker's legal team, the absence of the aggressive counter-narrative she'd expected, the missing press releases, the lawyers who had stopped speaking to local media. Silence from people with resources was not innocence. It was the sound of people looking at what was in front of them and making calculations. The indictment came down on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the night in the ER. Mara was finishing a chart at the nursing station when her phone buzzed with Adler's name. She read the message once, set the phone face down, and completed the chart. Then she picked the phone back up and read it again. Gerald Decker, 22 federal counts: healthcare fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. The filing included a wrongful death specification relating to Norma Restrepo, not a separate charge but embedded in the fraud count, the argument being that the falsified documentation and redirected medications had constituted deliberate deprivation of appropriate care. It was the harder argument Adler had described, and he had made it. Ryan Decker, 9 counts: assault, witness intimidation, conspiracy, and 2 counts related to the Meridian transport operation. The transport of Marcus Webb without medical authorization, using fabricated paperwork, had been characterized correctly as unlawful detention. Westbrook received a deferred prosecution agreement in exchange for his full cooperation. He resigned from Hargrove the same day. Mara heard about it from Sandra, who described his departure as quiet: box of personal items, parking lot, mid-morning, the exit of a man who had understood what the final accounting of his choices looked like and had nothing left to argue. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Mara testified on the second day, in a federal courtroom that smelled like wood polish and recycled air, with Gerald Decker seated at the defense table 30 feet away. She had testified before, in circumstances she still didn't discuss, and she knew how to be in a room where someone was watching you and hoping you would falter. She gave her account the way she'd given it to Adler: precise, chronological, honest about what she knew directly and what she had inferred. and she did not flinch when the defense attorney characterized her as a disgruntled employee pursuing a vendetta. "Were you angry that night?" the defense attorney asked. She considered the question honestly. "I was focused," she said. "Anger is a distraction in emergency medicine. I had a patient crashing and a man blocking access to care. I dealt with both." "You weren't frightened when Ryan Decker struck you?" "I noted the impact and kept working." She held his gaze. "That's what the job requires." He didn't have a follow-up that improved his position, so he sat down. Deanna Flores testified on the fourth day. She was not polished. Her voice shook twice, once when she described the sound of the code through the wall of Norma Restrepo's room. Once when she described the Decker Group consultant telling her that her informal observations had created a liability. The shaking was not a weakness. It was the specific credibility of someone telling the truth about something that had cost them, and the jury watched her with the attention of people who recognized the difference between rehearsed and real. Marcus Webb testified on the sixth day in a voice that did not shake at all. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. Gerald Decker, guilty on 19 of 22 counts. The three acquittals were on secondary wire fraud specifications that the jury had found insufficiently tied to the primary billing scheme, losses the prosecution had anticipated and structured around. The wrongful death specification was upheld. Ryan Decker, guilty on 7 of 9 counts. Sentencing was set for 60 days out. In the interim, Gerald Decker's bail was revoked on the basis of flight risk, a motion the prosecution had prepared and Adler had held until the verdict. He was taken from the courtroom by the same measured process as the arrest, controlled, specific, without drama, which was somehow the most complete version of justice Mara knew how to recognize. Not the violence of a fall, but the weight of consequence arriving exactly where it belonged. She was standing outside the courthouse when it ended, on the steps in the November air, which had gone properly cold by then, the season having finally committed to itself. Reyes was beside her. Cole sat between them, watching the street with the professional attention that never entirely turned off. "How do you feel?" Reyes asked. She thought about it. Not the way she'd paused before answers to manage them, but genuinely. Running through the last 6 weeks, the night in the ER, Jalen Torres's blood pressure dropping in Bay 3, the manila envelope on Patricia Decker's kitchen table, the fluorescent light that still flickered in the vending machine alcove because maintenance still hadn't replaced it. "Like something finished," she said. "Not like everything's fixed, like something finished." He nodded. He understood the distinction. "Adler wants you on a federal advisory panel," he said. "Healthcare fraud prevention. He asked me to mention it before he asks you officially." She looked at him. "When did he ask you?" "This morning." "And you waited until now?" "You had things to focus on." The corner of his mouth moved. "It's a real offer. He thinks you have a specific utility that doesn't come from federal backgrounds." She looked at the street. The November sky was the flat white of a day that hadn't decided between clouds and clarity, and the courthouse steps were cold under her feet. And somewhere across the city, Norma Restrepo's daughter was learning the verdict from a phone call, or a news alert, or a friend who'd been watching, and whatever she felt in that moment was hers. Not the resolution of grief, which didn't resolve, but the specific difference between not knowing and knowing. That was what justice actually was, Mara thought. Not the movie's version, not the clean clothes, not the villain's face when the handcuffs clicked. It was the moment when a daughter found out that the explanation she'd been given was a lie, and that the lie had been exposed, and that the people who had told it were being held to account. It was small and enormous simultaneously. It didn't bring anyone back. It didn't fix what had been broken. It just made the truth the official record, instead of the version that power had preferred. That was worth something. It wasn't everything, but it was worth something. "Tell Adler I'll call him," she said. She looked at Reyes. There were things between them that were still unresolved, the shape of whatever had been built across 6 weeks of operational proximity, the question of what came next in the structural sense, the conversation she'd recognized as belonging to a different time, and that now, possibly, belonged to this one. She didn't have clear answers about any of it. She suspected he didn't either, and she suspected they'd both, separately, arrived at the same conclusion, that unclear wasn't the same as absent. I'm going back to work tonight, she said. I know. You're staying in Raleigh? He looked at her steadily. For now. She picked up her bag, started down the steps, stopped one step below him and looked back. Webb called me yesterday, she said. He's out of Rex, back home. He said to tell you the coffee you brought him tasted like a wet cardboard box. That's accurate, Reyes said. Hospital vending hasn't improved. She turned back toward the street. She was not healed of anything, not the shoulder which ached in cold weather now, not the things she'd carried from before Hargrove, not the specific weight of having seen what institutions did when they decided that lives were overhead. She was not a different person than she'd been before that Thursday night in October. She was the same person, in the same work, carrying the same history. The difference was not in her. The difference was in the record, in what was officially, federally, irrevocably true. They had tried to make her small, had calculated that she would weigh the cost and step back and let the version of events that served them become the permanent one. It was a reasonable calculation based on how most of those situations had gone before. It had not accounted for the specific quality of a person who had learned, in harder places than a hospital corridor, that stepping back was sometimes exactly what the wrong side needed you to do. She walked down the courthouse steps into the November air, badge clipped to her coat, shift in 4 hours. The city ordinary and indifferent and entirely unchanged around her. She had never needed it to change. She had only ever needed to not kneel.